Wait, what? From this year onwards, during every Genshin Impact Anniversary version, we will offer travelers who unlocked Wish System a chance to get any 5-star from the Wanderlust Invocation for free! No way. This isn't real. Genshin Impact's anniversary rewards have largely been a giant joke, but starting this September, you'll be able to choose from any free 5-star character from Qiqi, Jean, Diluc, Keqing, Tighnari, Deya, and Mona. But with only being able to choose 1 out of 7 different characters, many people are wondering which is best for them, especially if they have some of these characters already and are considering getting constellations. That's why in this video we'll go over the value of these characters and their constellations for you. This will be my last video before I head out of town for my Twitch mod's wedding, so I want to bring it to you a bit early. You should be able to choose your free 5-star around September 28th, which is Genshin Impact's 4th anniversary, but on the very slim chance that you can get your free 5-star earlier, I wanted to bring you this video since I won't have time to make it overseas. But once I get back, if you would like a more in-depth guide about which 5-stars are the best to choose, then let me know in the comments below or on Twitch. And don't forget to sub for more videos and notifications about free Primogems. We're really close to 100,000 subscribers, and I'd love for you to be a part of that major milestone. And before I go over all of these 5-star characters individually, I want to give you one final tip. The standard banner 5-stars are not game-breaking. They have their uses, but oftentimes there are 4-stars that are almost as good and sometimes better than they are. So don't feel like you're totally missing out if you choose one character over another. I think this is really just the best time to pick your favorite or just a character that you can see yourself having the most fun with. So with that in mind, let's talk about the value of these individual 5-stars. We'll start with Qiqi, who was once considered S tier at Genshin's launch, but then fell to one of the lowest rated characters in all of the game. The reason for this is that Qiqi has a ton of problems. She heals for a massive amount, but she has really long cooldowns and a really high energy cost, so her massive heals often end up feeling like more of an emergency button rather than a consistent part of healing and your rotations. Her elemental skill applies very little cryo, and it only applies cryo to enemies if you're literally hugging them. Genshin teams want reliable elemental application, but Qiqi's elemental application is not only bad, but it can actually mess up certain setups if you don't want her elemental application but still get it anyways. The biggest problem with Qiqi, however, is that she does not generate any energy particles. This is horrible for a 5-star, and no other 5-star in the game has this problem. This means that it's much harder to use Qiqi's burst, but it also increases the energy requirements for everyone on a team with Qiqi. Party members rely on their teammates' energy particle generation in addition to their own, so using Qiqi in a team handicaps your team's potential. But Qiqi's Constellation 1 does give her 2 flat energy whenever her skill hits an enemy, but this is no solution because her skill has a very long cooldown of 30 seconds, and getting every instance of the skill to hit an enemy is inconsistent at best. So this energy just affects Qiqi, it also doesn't generate any particles for the team, and it's not enhanced by energy recharge. Qiqi's other constellations aren't very good either. Her Constellation 2 increases her normal and charged attack damage against enemies affected by cryo, which is fun if you want to build DPS Qiqi, but otherwise it's not useful. Her Constellation 3 and 5 increase the amount of healing she can output, which is already really massive, so you're not really gaining much there. Her C4 decreases the attack of enemies who are marked by her skill, which is nice, but not really necessary in a lot of teams. And her C6 is literally Barbara's C6, but for the whole party. Her final constellation isn't very good because we can just feed someone an egg and it totally negates the need for Qiqi's C6. My recommendation is not to get Qiqi as your free 5-star unless you really like her, because there's so many better options that just exist. If you want a cryo healer, the 4-star characters, Diona and Charlotte, are better than Qiqi, and if you want a 5-star healer, you're in luck because you can get a much better one for free in Jean. Jean is an Anemo healer and another 5-star that you can choose for free during the event. Jean is a really good early game carry as she can be a DPS that is also a healer at the same time. Later in the game though, her damage potential drops, but her support capability remains strong. Jean is also pretty fun, as her skill can yeet lightweight enemies off of cliffs and let fall damage or water take them out for you. Her burst creates a small field that massively heals you and continuously heals anyone inside while also applying animo to you. This makes for fun setups where you can use Jean and Bennett's bursts together and let the two circles swirl pyro without you having to do anything else. Jean can also hold the Viridescent artifact set, which is one of the most broken artifact sets in the entire game. She may not be able to swirl too much, but at least she has the option to enhance her team's damage. Jean is also an incredibly good pick if you have Farina, as the two of them are great together. Jean's Constellation 1 is fun for the overworld, but the pull speed really isn't necessary since you normally just use her tap skill in combat anyways. Her C2 is quite nice for comfort, giving your team a movement speed and attack speed buff when she gets an elemental particle. This is far from overpowered, but it does feel pretty nice. Her C3 and C5 are fine, as her skill and burst are pretty good, but they don't dramatically make Jean better, so they're not super necessary. Her Constellation 4 decreases enemy animo resistance by 40% when they're in her burst. This is a really good effect, but the condition can be hard to meet because Jean's elemental burst has a very small radius. Her C6 decreases the damage you take by 33% while in her elemental burst. This is a nice constellation, but it would have been way better if it gave you permanent interruption resistance while in her burst instead. Overall, Jean is a great choice and a highly recommended character to pick up. Her C2 is pretty nice, and if you can get her C4, she becomes great with Wanderer and Zhao, especially when paired with Farina. If you don't have any particular standard 5-star character that you like, I recommend Jean as a good support for her decent versatility, fun with her skill in the overworld, and comfort from her strong heals. The next character we'll talk about is our first on-field DPS and Jean's special friend, Diluc. Diluc was among the game's first S-tier characters, but he fell off pretty hard, and then had a surprising resurgence thanks to Cloud Retainer's ability. Diluc is a decent pyro damage dealer, but the problem is that there are just so many good pyro damage dealers already, and Diluc is nowhere near as strong as Hu Tao or Arlecchino, and since they often want these same supports that he does, it feels like it's a waste to get Diluc if you already have or plan to get Hu Tao or Arlecchino. But Diluc does do extremely well with Cloud Retainer because he has incredibly high scaling on his plunge attacks. This puts Diluc back in the spotlight, but he also has some competition from the 4-star character Ga Ming, who is a plunge attack pyro DPS that also hits very hard. The plunge attack playstyle is currently the best way to get the most damage out of Diluc, and his constellations don't really help that out. So if you have or plan to get Cloud Retainer and you want to use Diluc, C0 is all you need. However, if you don't want to play him as a plunge attack DPS, his constellations are all focused on him being on field. His C1 increases damage against enemies with over half health. This is nice, but it's not really worth going for. His C2 increases his attacks and his attack speed, which seems really nice, but the condition of taking damage isn't great because Diluc needs to get hit 3 times to really get value out of this constellation, and it doesn't increase his interruption resistance, so it feels pretty bad in practice. His C3 and C5 are talent level ups, which is nice, but they still don't make him as strong as other 5-star limited pyro DPS options. His C4 rewards you for having good timing on his elemental skill by using them one after another within 2 seconds. Sometimes this can feel clunky, but it is a solid damage increase. His C6 makes his normal attack and skill chain combo feel more complete, but honestly it's not worth going for this many copies of Diluc when you can just pick up Cloud Retainer when she reruns and have a C0 Diluc that can outperform a C6 one. Keqing is our next choice of free on-field damage dealer. She, like Diluc, is not bad, but is certainly overshadowed by better Electro characters. Dendro teams make Keqing feel pretty good, and it's fun to teleport from one place to another with her elemental skill. But outside of overworld exploration, Keqing is not particularly great. It doesn't help that a 4-star character like Fischl is often better in most teams than Keqing is. Keqing is quite flashy and visually appealing, but it doesn't feel great when you do a bunch of cool sword teleportation attacks and then are still outperformed by a big Electro Parrot. And this is really the biggest downside of Keqing. She's really easily replaceable in just about any team that she does well in. Keqing's constellations are also really lackluster. Her C1 and C2 are negligible in terms of how much they benefit her. Her C3 and C5 are some of her stronger constellations, which is not usually a great sign for characters. Her C4 gives her a decent attack buff, but it's not nearly as good as other characters' 4th constellations, and her C6 can give you up to a 24% electro damage increase, but it has 4 specific requirements that you have to meet in order to get the maximum value out of this constellation. That being said, it's actually really easy for Keqing to get the full bonus, but there's some 3-star weapons that offer more value than Keqing C6, so it's totally not worth going for. So if you do want Keqing, C0 is enough, and the other constellations won't change much about her. Next we move on to Tighnari, the Dendro on-field damage dealer of the free 5 stars. Tighnari's charge attacks can hit pretty hard, but they come out pretty fast, and it can be disorienting to play him. And if you're a mobile player, you'll definitely want to practice charge shots with a bow character in combat before you choose Tighnari, because playing a charged shot bow character on mobile can range from being tricky to an absolute nightmare. But if you really need an on-field DPS, Tighnari is the strongest of the free 5 stars outside of Plunge Attack Diluc with Cloud Retainer. Tighnari also has the advantage of being able to use the 3-star weapon, the Slingshot, to great effect, making him fairly free-to-play friendly to build. Tighnari's constellations are also a lot higher quality than the other 5-star characters, but that isn't saying too much. His C1 increases his charge attack crit rate by 15%, which is pretty nice. His C2 gives him a Dendro damage bonus when opponents enter the field created by his elemental skill, and it's about a 10% DPS increase overall. His C3 increases his elemental burst damage, which is pretty nice because it hits pretty hard already. His C4 can give everyone on the team up to 120 extra elemental mastery, which is very helpful for him, but also the electro characters that you'll want to pair with him. His C5 isn't really that good, as his skill is mostly just used for the utility of getting the quick charge shots out, so the extra levels here are not really that important. And his Constellation 6 makes Tighnari hit much harder with his charge attacks. It decreases the charge time on his special arrow by 0.9 seconds, while also adding an extra homing arrow that deals 150% of his attack as damage. This is Tighnari's best constellation, and it's well over a 20% increase in his total damage. But Tighnari doesn't need constellations to be good, he just gets more value out of them, particularly his C2 and his C6. If you feel like you need a good on-field DPS, Tighnari is a solid choice, just make sure you enjoy playing him before choosing the Flowery Forest Ranger. Next we have Deya, who seems like she's an on-field main DPS, but Hoyle gave her some incredibly bad talent scaling that is worse than several 4 stars. Deya is really just a pseudo-tank character that absorbs damage from some of your team and then heals it off. She also provides a field that gives you a few seconds of interruption resistance, which is always nice. Unfortunately, she also has a lot of problems. Besides her damage being really bad, she can be knocked out of her elemental burst or crowd controlled during its duration, which completely ends the burst, and that feels really terrible, and it's a unique problem for Deya that other characters just don't have to worry about. Her elemental skill that deploys a field also has a very long cooldown and low uptime, and the interruption resistance she provides has an even lower uptime. Interestingly, Deya does better with a full elemental mastery build for Burgeon teams than she does as a DPS. However, I suspect Natlin will have a few characters that make Deya a little bit more useful. It won't fix the problems of her kit, but there may be some characters that appreciate her a little bit more in the future. Deya's constellations make her better, but that's mostly because her kit is just really bad at its base level. Her C1 increases her max HP and gives her a small damage bonus based on her max HP. The damage increase is pretty small, but the extra HP is nice. Her C2 increases the duration of the field from her elemental skill by 6 seconds, which is a huge quality of life improvement, and it also increases the coordinated attack damage from the skill for one attack, which seems nice, but since Deya's talent scaling is so bad, this practically does very little damage. Her C3 and C5 are almost necessary if you want her to deal any damage, but they're not worth going for. Her 4th constellation adds a small energy and HP restoration effect to each hit of her elemental burst. This is nice, but her burst is just so bad to begin with that it's not really worth using, and you can still get knocked out of her burst anyways. Deya's Constellation 6 gives her elemental burst increased crit rate and crit damage. It seems pretty good at first, but it doesn't solve her burst problems, and more importantly, Deya also has problems getting enough energy to use her burst off cooldown in the first place. It also has a long cooldown of 18 seconds, meaning her C6 ends up feeling more like a chore to use rather than being a good benefit. I would not recommend Deya for most people, but she is an interesting tech option for Burgeon teams, and if you want her, C0 is okay, but just not for damage, and her C1 and especially C2 make her feel much better to use, but again, they don't really help her damage at all. The next 5-star on the list is also in a weird position. She's not a damage dealer, but she can contribute massive amounts of damage to the team in one go. Mona is pretty much a staple of one-shot teams that aim to do over 1 million damage in one hit. And while that sounds very impressive, she actually has very few practical uses, especially compared to how desired and useful other 5-star Hydro characters are. But Mona still has a lot of synergy and can be a great damage buffing character, if only for a very limited time. Mona's most valuable ability is her Elemental Burst, which can be quite complex, but I'll simplify it for you. Using her burst applies Hydro to enemies and traps smaller enemies. This is called the Illusory Bubble, and think of it like the Abyss Mage bubbles that we all hate very, very much, but used against enemies and also invisible. The cast of the burst does not deal any damage, but instead applies a debuff called Omen, which increases the damage the enemies take for a few seconds. Once you hit an enemy after using Mona's burst, it pops the bubble and deals significant damage, which is also affected by the Omen debuff on the enemies. So you can think of Mona's burst as a form of delayed damage that triggers when you hit an enemy after using it. This is why Mona is great in one-shot team compositions or freeze compositions, but not in many other places. Her skill also doesn't apply that much Hydro, making her underperform in teams that want Hydro application. But Mona can also buff the team in many other ways, such as holding the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, the Favonius Codex, or using the Noblesse artifact set or the Tenacity artifact set. For constellations, Mona's C1 is a nice increase in damage for Hydro-related reactions, which is basically a focus of any team that you'll use her in. Mona's C2 makes her a bit better as an on-field damage dealer by giving her a chance to automatically use a charged attack. This attack does not interrupt her normal attack animations or combos, so when it procs, it's just free damage. Mona's C3 is way better than her C5, as her burst is much more important than her elemental skill. Mona's C4 is arguably her best constellation, giving team members an extra 15% crit rate when they attack an enemy affected by the Omen debuff applied after using her elemental burst. This buff applies to the character who pops the bubble, but also Mona's damage from the bubble popping too. Her C6 increases her charged attack damage, but you have to sprint for several seconds to get the maximum value of this buff, and it's pretty clunky to use overall. It does give Mona the potential to be a strong forward vaporized DPS, but if you want someone that does that, just wish for Mualani, as she will do it better at C0 anyways. Mona is a fun character for making big damage per screenshot setups, but she doesn't have too many uses other than that. And unless someone has a very specific setup in mind they want to use Mona for, I would not recommend selecting her as your free 5-star. If you do want Mona or her constellations, C1 is a good stopping point, but C3 and C4 have their uses, but anything beyond that just isn't worth it. With the overview finished, who is the best? Like I said before, the 5 stars really aren't game breaking, so just pick the one that you like the most. For general recommendations, I would say Jean offers a lot of value, especially if you have Farina, and Tighnari is the best on-field damage dealer of the bunch, unless you can play Diluc Plunge. Mona and Deya have some fun niche value, and I would not recommend Qiqi or Keqing unless you just want them. I'm personally going for Deya because I love my Burgeon Deya and her first 2 constellations would be helpful for me. But let me know who you're pulling for. I'll see you when I get back, everyone. I love you, stay jawsome, and I can't wait to see you when I return.